All right, folks. Well, welcome to another year of Hot Rhythm. It's great to be here and great to present once again this really neat old technology from 100 years ago. We love the music of the swing era. That's why we're all here. But a lot of people don't know how those recordings were made, and how all of those classics that we love to dance to, or in my case, perform, were even made originally. But it's a whole really interesting process that went into the development of that. And since I did this last year, I actually was lucky enough to purchase a recording machine from 1934. And it's what you see right here. I call this my movie star recording machine because this was actually used in the Bradley Cooper film Maestro recently, in the scene where they're cutting demos in Leonard Bernstein's loft. This is the machine they used, and I'm friends with the people who restored it for the film in New York, and I used a grant to buy it after they were done. It was restored for the movie, so perfectly, usable. But 1934 is a long way from the beginning of this stuff. So I'm going to walk you through each step of how recordings came to be, how you got from something that looked like this to something a little bit more familiar that looks like this. So I'll start with just a little recorded message here, using the earliest form of recorded music technology, which is the cylinder. This is a machine from 1897, so you may want to be a little quiet because they didn't really have volume controls like they do now.
Hello, this is Colin Hancock speaking direct from the phonograph. I recorded this a couple of hours ago on my Edison machine, and I'm playing it for you on my Columbia machine. Welcome to Hot Rhythm. I hope you're having a wonderful time, and let's check out some more nerdy cool stuff.
So that was me playing a little bit slow, I admit, so maybe my voice sounded an octave lower. But it's a recording made on this wax cylinder. This technology was the first commercially viable medium for listening to commercial music. But it actually wasn't the first way that it was recorded, although the cylinder format itself was. For that, we have to go back really, really early, actually even before Thomas Edison, which is kind of the most common misconception about all this, is that Edison created recording. He actually did not. You have to go back to the 1850s, to France. There was a gentleman by the name of Leon Scott de Martinville who was interested in the possibility of transcribing sound waves. It's not something you can do. You can't tell what words are from sound waves. That's just not how sound works. That's also weirdly biased to French or whatever language people thought you'd be able to transcribe. That's just not how sound waves work. So what he did was he took a piece of paper and he coated it with coal dust and then put that on a cylindrical piece of metal and had a wooden horn and spoke into it, which would be etched with the point of a feather. Really, really strange technology, 1800s, they're just kind of throwing stuff at the walls and seeing what sticks. And obviously he couldn't transcribe it, so they filed it away in the archives, never really to be seen again, or so they thought, until in the past couple of decades, they've actually been able to use laser technology to read the sound waves like you would read it on here and play it back. So the earliest recordings we have of the human voice were made in France in the 1850s and early 1860s. There's a recording of A Clair de la Lune. I think there's one where he drops something and says some profanity. I mean, it's the whole human experience. It's really neat. It wasn't. I mean, well, now it's played back with laser technology. They thought at the time that there would be some weird way to read the words that were spoken, and you can't do that. That's just not how sound works. Yeah. So that kind of got filed away, but the idea of it kind of sat floating in the scientific community for nearly 2 decades. Then, in the mid-1870s, Thomas Edison was experimenting with telephone receivers and various other pieces of technology and realized that sound caused a vibration when he spoke into it. I'm sure he was somewhat informed by what Leon Scott de Martinville did. He was very much cued into modern science at the time, but it's kind of up for debate. What matters is he realized that you could play this stuff back if you simply had the same needle that you used to cut it, or a needle like it, to just read the groove back and come out of a funnel like this. So in 1877, rather than using soot-covered paper, he used tinfoil, and it worked. It recorded the human voice, and he was able to play it back, and it was the biggest revolution in science at the time. He immediately went to the White House to do a demonstration. It was published in the Scientific American. It was displayed all over the country and then all over the world. And then, kind of like Leon Scott de Martinville's invention, it just kind of sat. Because tinfoil would wear out very quickly, especially, they didn't have modern hi-fi stereos back then. It would be playing it on the same machine you recorded it, so it's just grinding it to a pulp, basically. That was not sustainable for recording commercial music. It was great for a party trick or a demonstration, but it was not really a way that you could, record your band and then have your fans listen to you or something. That wasn't even really conceptual at the time. And so between the late 1870s and the late 1880s, this technology was messed around with a lot. Alexander Graham Bell messed around with it a lot, and he was really the first one to kind of experiment with discs, although the discs he was using were either wax or zinc, so they don't sound great, but lots of those survive. A lot of them are in the Smithsonian. There are some tinfoil slips that have survived that were played back once and then filed away. There's one made in St. Louis in 1878 that actually has like a cornet player and all sorts of stuff. And then they started messing around with cylinders. Alexander Graham Bell and Charles Tainter were messing with these kind of long cylinders which were cardboard with a very thin coating of wax. Again, not a very sustainable way to play these things. Very, very kind of finicky. But in 1888, Thomas Edison once again decided, okay, it's time to really nail this out and get this right. And so there's a famous photo of Edison kind of leaning next to a phonograph that if you type in Thomas Edison phonograph on Google, it's the first thing you'll see probably. And it's to commemorate, I think it was a 72-hour long marathon in his lab of developing the cylinder from tinfoil to wax. And the first kind of wax he used was paraffin, which is basically candle wax, which is still more durable than tinfoil. And it was a huge revelation. He brought the phonograph then to England, where he recorded a choir of, I think, 4,000 people singing Handel's Messiah in the Crystal Palace. He also recorded a bunch of kind of British nobility. Then people brought the phonograph over to the European mainland and recorded a bunch of classical people. I think Johannes Brahms even was recorded on those. So it was very important. But even paraffin wore too much. So after a little more development, you finally got the first really viable way of selling and recording these things, which is brown wax. And that's the technology I recorded my slightly too slow played back message on earlier. From 1890 or so, or 1889 to around 1902, that was how records were cut and made on brown wax, usually directly made. You didn't really have a mass copying process unless you either literally stuck a tube from one phonograph to another one with a blank record and just played it and recorded it at the same time. Those are called tube copies. Or they had something called a pantograph, which kind of had a needle on one end and a needle on the other, and it would just kind of track at the same time. And both of those sounded really bad. I mean, just really faint and harsh. I mean, you heard how weak it already is as a direct recording. Imagine with a tube. I mean, it's just, it again was not a great way to do this. But then in 1902, they developed a process called molding, which was the first copying process. So rather than having a record made just directly, like with the band playing, or with 10 phonographs in front of a band running all at once, which is something they did, you can make one copy and then just kind of stamp copies, or in this case, it was kind of like a big can with the grooves, and then you put wax in and then take it out and it would make a copy. to mass produce these things. So this is a cylinder from around 1905 made using that technology. It's also a good deal louder, you'll notice.
This is the Hungarian orchestra.
At the same time, you also had the invention of the spring-powered phonograph. You may have noticed this little thing moving around. It's because you have a little spring motor in here. And that was a huge revolution because people forget that in the early 1900s, most of the Western world was not, did not have electrical power. That really wasn't something that was available, especially to people who lived in rural places until the Great Depression or later. So having something powered by spring rather than battery, which is what the original ones were made of, it's this crazy acid battery system, was great because you didn't have to plug it in. You could bring it anywhere. You could bring it on your picnic. You could bring it in your living room, wherever. Now, you're probably wondering, when do these things come into play? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Alexander Graham Bell and a few other people had been experimenting with them, but they were not able to get the same quality of fidelity as they were on cylinders for a long time with disc recording. And also, disc recording itself is actually kind of a different process. When you have cylinders, you may notice you have this reproducer that floats on top as it plays back. And that's because the grooves themselves are cut vertically, as in up and down. The deeper the groove, the deeper the modulation, the louder it is. With discs, you can have vertical recording, but the real revolution was lateral recording, which means instead of the groove moving up and down, it moves side to side as it cuts. And that enabled louder grooves, deeper grooves, more consistent grooves. They perfected vertical recording over time. This is a vertical path A, but even this has tracking problems, and it's from 1920. And Edison kind of created the gold standard of vertical recording. This is an Edison diamond disc. It's a 1/4 of an inch thick for those up and down grooves. And you had to have an Edison machine or a Brunswick machine, which was compatible with Edison, to play it back. So again, for the masses, it wasn't really a viable technology unless you had bought one, 20 years ago and just decided to keep holding on to it. Lateral recording just was easier to do. And these are much easier to store than these. So between 1900 and 1910, you really had a battle for which technology was going to take over. But by 1910, they still were making cylinders, but discs were really cornering the market at that point. Discs originally, I think this one is an example, were one-sided. You only had one selection, just like one selection on a cylinder. But then, around 1908, they developed the two-sided disc. So then you could have multiple selections on a record, an A side and a B side, which was a whole thing that they were still figuring out even into the 20s. What is the A side, what is the B side, which side do we really want to sell, which one's important, which isn't, are they both important? Well, how do we program it, all these things were new. But as the industry kept going, and especially after World War II, World War I, when the dance crazes really kind of took over, and jazz also was introduced with the recorded mediums, the market started to kind of go in more of a direction. It wasn't going all over the place as much, and people were really starting to buy the records for the songs and eventually the bands. So you had a few people who became phonograph stars, or these kind of early recording industry stars, people who were marketed mainly because they could record well, because when you made a recording like this back then, acoustically, you'd play into a horn. And you heard how faint it is. You really have to push. You have to sing loud, you have to perform loud, you have to be a strong performer and a present performer. And a lot of people who were good in a parlor singing with a violin and a harp or something didn't really translate very well to this medium. So things like jazz bands with trumpets and clarinets and banjos and tubas recorded very well. So here's an example from 1922. This is the song Hot Lips which was written by Henry Lang, who led a band in Texas in the 20s, actually. But this just gives you an idea of how these discs sound early on. Much louder, much clearer. It's an improvement. You can hear it's filling the room. I'm sorry? Many things. The weight of this on here is more than this. The grooves are deeper. The performance is louder. I mean, it's just the technology was better. The cutting head probably was more sensitive, so it picked up more sound. But they just perfected the technology. I mean, it's like an iPod from 2008 versus an iPhone now. They just perfected it. Yep. Yep. Exactly.
Mechanically, you've got a head on it.
Yep.
It vibrates in the track.
Yep.
How does that generate? What does that vibrate to get the noise?
Sure. So on here, there's a diaphragm, a glass diaphragm, and as the needle vibrates, there's a little bar here they call it a stylus bar, and it transmits that vibration to this diaphragm, which is then open to this tube, which.
You said that was made out of glass.
Yeah.
So it's that glass vibrating which is channeled down to.
Yeah. It's very simple. Think tin can with a string on it, and then tin can on the other end. It's just glorified that. It's just moving the sound waves. So you had acoustic recording kind of reach its apex around this time, maybe a couple years later. It sounds pretty good, right? But it's not quite as lifelike, maybe, as the music that we're used to. And the reason I didn't bring an acoustic recording machine, but rather an electric recording machine today, is because 100 years ago, this year, 1925, marks the transition to really modern recording, which is electrical recording. The shift from playing into this or shouting into this to singing into a mic. And I thought, what better record at UT to demonstrate electric recording and how it sounds than Texas Fight by the UT Band from 1928. So this is recorded in San Antonio. They had to travel to San Antonio to make this. But it's electric, not acoustic. So I'll be curious what you notice the differences are. We don't need that part. So, anybody notice any differences? Curious. Absolutely. Yeah. They are tight. Anybody else? Yes.
Distinguish between the bass and the treble instruments.
Exactly. It's more dynamic. The clarity of the recording, the space between the instruments, the frequency range, it's all much improved. I think by hundreds, if not thousands, of cycles of frequency.
So all the clicks that you would hear, the spark, the crackle,
It's just the quality of the record and the shellac itself. But yeah, so anyway, that is how recording shifted. Basically, you know how microphones work. You have the sound collected, which hits kind of a membrane in here, and then you transmit that sound into here. We have tubes, which kind of collect the sound and then bring them into this cutting head, which has a sapphire stylus. So you're able to control volume, you're able to control kind of the different bass and treble and things. Not on this particular machine, although I do have that set up in my computer, which I'm using as a preamp. It's sort of portable. They didn't have Macs in 1934, but whatever. And so you have just a lot more control over the quality of the recording, which was a huge shift and really helped with recording different kind of textures and things. It's really interesting. They recorded the Rhapsody in Blue in 1924 when it originally was debuted, and they had to kind of shift the instrumentation a little bit to fit acoustic recording. But then in 1927, they re-recorded it, and they were able to use the original instrumentation with all the string basses and things like that, the full symphonic sound, and it was a revelation. And you see more copies of the electric one than the acoustic one. So anyway, that is how you get to the recording technology that was used in the 1920s and 30s and even into the 40s to cut your favorite swing records. Yes? For a time, yes. Eventually you did have electrical playback. This machine, I haven't restored the electrical playback head, but it actually has an electrical playback head on it. That was available even in the late 20s. I mean, there are Edison radio phonographs which have electrical pickup heads on them, but it was still kind of a novelty for a while. Radio stations, had electrical playback. But really it wasn't until the invention of the lightweight tone arm, the tone arm is the thing that, goes across the record, that was really more viable. And even then, a lot of them still, you'll see if somebody posts on Facebook or something or YouTube a video of a record played on a really early electric machine, they'll be like, that's bad for the record in the comments, Yes and no. Yes. Oh man, for recording, it's a huge upgrade compared to a steel needle for recording. It's just a smoother cut, a more consistent groove, a deeper groove, a groove with higher frequencies. A steel needle, I have some steel cutting needles and it works, but it's just noisy. It's just a really noisy groove. A sapphire, it's much quieter. All right, so I think I've blabbed enough. Now I want to show you how these things are actually made, but I'm going to require some assistance. I think it'd be really fun to have all of you kind of participate in this, and I'm going to need a volunteer from the audience to help me actually make this record. So somebody who isn't afraid to handle this machinery with me. Luke, would you like to? All right. So I have here a paintbrush, but it's not going to be a paintbrush today. What it's going to be is, as the record is cut, you get what's called swarf. It's the little shavings. That, if it gets stuck in the grooves while it's cutting, is going to cause the record to skip. It will get stuck under the needle will jump, and you won't have a consistent groove. I can't promise that we won't still have something like that this time, but if you help me out with this, it'll be a lot better. So basically what you're going to do is, as the record is moving across the platter, you just kind of gently brush it. Don't apply pressure, just kind of.
So it's kind of same spot,
Yep.
same angle?
I'll show you just how.
Okay.
Now, before we do that, we're going to need a blank record, which I have here. I'm going to be using a modern company's blanks just because it's easier to use, but it's basically the same kind of thing. You can use acetate, lacquer. This is kind of a PVC type material. It all gets the same result. And then you're probably wondering why I have Lemon Pledge. Back in the day, they would have used graphite, which is much nastier. But this is for two purposes. One, to make sure the surface of the record is smooth. And two, the small film that it leaves actually, through physics, helps create more suction as the needle hits the record and gets a deeper groove. So it kind of does two functions. It does smell good. Probably smells better than graphite. You'll notice there's 2 holes in this record. That's because if you just have one, it's much more prone to slipping as the needle cuts on it. But with 2, you see here, there's these little kind of holes on here. It kind of clips it into place. They had it all really figured out by 1934, more or less. I mean, you know, they didn't have digital recording, but sometimes people don't actually like that as much as analog recording. It's like a different type of paint, you know. Okay, so let's just make sure everything's running here. Yep. Let's turn that up. Hello. Okay. Yep, good. So, as this moves across, you'll see little strands coming off, just like that.
So should I target the strands or
Just kind of bring the strands right to the middle.
Okay.
That's it. So what I'm going to do to involve all of y'all is I'm going to say, what do we want? And I want you all to say, hot rhythm. And I'm going to say, when do we want it? And you're going to say, now. And then I'm going to play a song. And then if you want at the end, you can applaud or boo or whatever you want. But it'll make it on the record. So, should we do this? Yeah. Let's do it. All right. Let me just, yep. Let me make sure this thing's in tune. Yeah. All right, here we go. Go for it. All right, folks, what do we want? Hot rhythm. I said, what do we want? Hot rhythm. And when do we want it? Now. All right. And there you have it, my folks. That's how you make a record.
So that's what all this is.
That's what all that is. So, I didn't bring a modern turntable because I wanted to see if I could play you this back on this old wind-up machine so you could hear the difference between a live performance and what the record sounds like when you play it back. Let's see what we got. Okay. Get the speed right. There you have it. There you go. I'll let you guys pass this around if you want to take a look. And any questions anybody has or anything? Okay.
So you said if you play that on a modern record player, it would sound different?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Way different. Way clearer. Way way more lifelike.
We could play it tomorrow at my.
Oh yeah. I might hand it to you. Yeah.
It sounds like an overdrive pedal or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I just, if I were really doing this, I would have taken levels. I'm just kind of,
Does it have the same effect on the sound waves, or does that?
Yeah, it's very similar. I mean, yeah, it's just, I was just probably too hot on the mic, but, yeah. Oh well. Anybody else? Sure. Absolutely. So what you have being passed around now is called the master. It would have been usually wax, and then in the 30s, lacquer was kind of the medium that took over. And when you have a wax master, you generally don't want to play that much because each time you play it, you lose just a little bit of fidelity, even on a lightweight modern machine. Certainly not as much, but even then. So what you do is you take your master, and then you'd electroplate a metal mother, which is a reverse, so the grooves are literally, reversed upward, and then you stamp it, just like, you'd stamp a rubber stamp or something like that, and that's how you make copies. And so if you look on a lot of these old records, they actually have like the stamper number and a letter, because some records were so popular, you'd have to make so many metal copies from the master or copies from a metal mother even, that you see like, the optimal would be A1, right? But you see like G7 or even like R12 or something. I mean, maybe not that often, but it happens if you had a big hit. But with each generation, you lose a little bit of fidelity. So I work a lot in record restoration and reissues, and a lot of times they say, oh, look for an early stamper, an A1 or a B2 or something like that. So, yeah. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun. It's really cool to show this technology and show you how these things were made. And if anybody wants to come up and take a look at this machinery, feel free. And if you have any questions, I'll be here until the next thing comes along. So thank you.